Start on Mark Hess, I'm the director here at Chik-Wauk, and first of all, thanks all for coming and making the drive up here. We always appreciate that. Hopefully you'll have a chance to spend a little bit of extra time meandering through all our great buildings and things. But we're excited to have Dr. Seth Moore. I'm going to read, if it's okay, right off your little introduction. Seth is the Grand Portage Tribal Wildlife Biologist. So the Grand Portage Reservation is located at the far northeast corner of Minnesota, so right at the very tip on the rocky shore of Lake Superior in Cook County. And I've done that canoe trip from here. It's a great trip if you ever get a chance, ending on the Grand Portage.
You did the Grand Portage?
Of course he did.
I have done that, carrying a canoe the whole way. So, the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior Chippewa engages in fisheries and wildlife research projects throughout the year, working with moose, wolves, fish, deer, grouse, and environmental issues. Dr. Seth Moore is a wildlife biologist. He leads the biology and environmental department at Grand Portage Trust Lands. So thank you for coming and making the drive up here.
Thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here. I'm not sure you should be clapping yet. You should reserve that judgment for later. We'll see how I do with advancing these slides.
I can come up with it.
No, I think this will work. So today I'm going to talk. Today I'm going to talk about some of the work that we're doing for the Grand Portage Band of Chippewa. I will start very nationally and then move more locally with the work that we're doing. But I want to touch on some major issues that are going on in this world in terms of climate justice, social justice, and environmental justice. Given the size of this tribe, of this group, it's a more intimate group. If you have some questions, it will not offend me in the slightest if you ask them on the fly. Sometimes it makes things a bit more interesting for me as a presenter. I give lots of presentations, and I'm very comfortable with that type of format. So if you have questions, shout them out, and we'll move forward. The context for this talk, I gave this presentation initially, I think 2 years ago, just prior to the recent presidential election. And I was invited by the Chicago League of Women Voters to give a presentation to help to encourage women, younger women, to vote in the next election, and to do so in terms of climate justice, social justice, and environmental justice. So I put a lot of thought into this presentation, and what I did to do so was I reached out to all of my women colleagues to help me frame this conversation and this presentation. And so if you look at this list of women on the right, these are top-notch scientists and advocates in environmental justice, social justice, and climatic justice, and a fantastic group of people to work with. So for those of you who are not aware, Grand Portage is located extreme northeastern tip of Minnesota. We are on Lake Superior. We are on the border with Ontario. The Grand Portage Band, like many of the Ojibwa tribes in Minnesota, reserved rights to hunt, fish, and gather in signing a treaty with the federal government in 1854. And what happened was there was a lot of conflict in the 1800s between the U.S. tribes and U.S. citizens. So the federal government sought out treaties with the tribes, whereby the tribes ceded vast areas of North America for use by the federal government. But in doing so, tribes reserved rights to hunt, fish, and gather into perpetuity on these lands. And so these are essentially property rights. The Grand Portage Band of Chippewa, the Boys Fork Band of Chippewa, and the Fond du Lac Band of Chippewa have rights to hunt, fish, and gather on 5 million acres of northeastern Minnesota. And those rights are very similar to severed mineral rights, if anybody is familiar. If you own a property and somebody else owns the mineral rights to that property, they have a right to extract those minerals from that land. In the same way the tribes in Minnesota have a right to extract subsistence foods, medicines from this land. And so my job is to help to make sure there's something that can be subsisted off of on this land and to make sure that it's healthy. Now, the Grand Portage Reservation is about 70 square miles. Right at the tip, this yellow line is the border with Ontario. This is Lake Superior. There are only 3 gravel roads that traverse that 70 square miles. There are about 300 residences, primarily filled with tribal members. Grand Portage still has commercial and subsistence fisheries, and I love this image because it ties in directly with things I want to talk about today. This is a tribal fisherman. He also works for my department. In his left hand, he's holding a coho salmon. This is a Pacific salmon. It's not native to Lake Superior or to the Great Lakes. Been stocked after Western settlement. And in this hand, he's holding a northern pike. Northern pike, as a consequence of warming water temperatures in Lake Superior, are increasing in abundance in Pigeon Bay. And so we see a climate justice issue here. Yeah. We see a social justice issue here. Yeah. Yeah. Whoops. Okay, so the reservation itself is primarily undeveloped. We have these glacial relics. These are the same glacial relics that comprise the Sawtooth Range. I'm not a geologist, so I can't give you too much detail other than what is left after the most recent ice age. I particularly like this image. This image is an image of lake trout. Lake trout are a primary fish species used for subsistence by the Grand Portage Band. But what I like about this image is, my job working for the tribe is to blend both Western science and a Chippewa worldview in the work that I do. If you think about the scientific name for lake trout, Salvelinus, Latin, Western name, Namikush, Ojibwa name. It's actually a blend in its scientific name of Ojibwa and Western science. It's perfectly fitting for the things that I do in my work. Moose are the primary subsistence species on a terrestrial basis used by the tribe. I spend an enormous amount of my time and energy and our resources studying this species. And Grand Portage has a healthy population of handsome biologists that study historic fish, and so the lake sturgeon is a fish species we've been trying to restore in Grand Portage as well. And we have healthy and self-sustaining populations of wolves. This picture I particularly like. I grew up in a house with 3 sisters. There were 4 of us kids. And for Christmas every year, my mom would ask us to go to Sears and get a family portrait. And it was absolutely torture for them as photographers, trying to get 4 kids to sit still for a photographer. And my punishment for that was getting this image of these 4 wolf pups. I took hundreds and hundreds of images before I could get all 4 siblings in one image.
That's awesome.
Thanks, yeah, I like that. And the other thing that's cool about Grand Portage is we have tribal youth practicing a subsistence lifestyle. And this young woman, she's a mom now actually, is holding a coaster brook trout, which is actually the same fish here, the same species of fish here. Holding a coaster brook trout, we've been trying to restore them. They're a native species to this area. And so it was really cool that we had restored them in this lake, and she was able to catch one and feed her family with it. So here's where I'll try to tie together the work that I do as a scientist with the Ojibwa culture and worldview. And we practice at the tribe this concept called 7th generation planning, where this is the idea that any individual is touched by 7 generations in their life, from a great-grandparent to a great-grandchild. Wow. And thus we have an obligation to leave this planet in a manner that someone 7 generations from now can continue to use it in the way that we do currently. A perfect tie for the things that I like to do, restoring natural resources. There's this concept in Ojibwa culture of a oneness of nature and humanity. I've heard tribal elected leaders say, when negotiating with federal leaders, that they represent those that can't speak, the 4-legged creatures, the winged creatures, the plants and the animals. And then the last thing, this is an important point, an important distinction, is that the rights reserved by the tribes in this region to hunt, fish, and gather also is an indication that what they hunt, fish, and gather has to be consumable. You can't have fish that are laden with mercury, or I call that an environmental abrogation of treaty rights. Essentially, the treaty rights are violated if our foods are not consumable, if our water is not drinkable, and if our air is not breathable. So for someone like me, it gives me a great platform for the type of work that I like to do. In this presentation, we'll use some statistical methods and some statistical graphical tools. And I like to use these Venn diagrams where you can take a number of disparate characteristics and merge them together, and at the center of those characteristics is a blend of all the different things that are disparate. And then as you get towards the outside, you see each of the different things that feature that thing in the center. So I work, using a Venn diagram, at the nexus of humans, animals, and the environment. And that is the scientific field called ecosystem health. Very much ties with the Chippewa worldview of environmental stewardship. All right, I'm going to start at a national level, and then we'll focus down to a more local level. So at a national level, and even an international level, we have experienced a lack of leadership on climate health and general environmental health. In this country in particular, we have climate change denial. Facts are irrefutable. And in past history, we had people that refuted the concept that the Earth was actually spherical rather than flat. And over time, there was a sufficient amount of knowledge that people came to conclude that the Earth was not in fact flat and was in fact round. And I think we will get to that same state with climate change awareness, but that is not something that is debated in the scientific community at all. It's just not, we're so far past the point of debate about whether or not climate change is occurring. Now we're talking about how severe is climate change going to be, and will humanity actually survive it? We have a history of environmental deregulation in the United States in particular because of the fact that general environmental health has not really been a priority. In the United States, we have science illiteracy. Worse, we have science bashing. It's interesting to me that some folks will trust a medical doctor, but they will not trust an environmental doctor. As an analogy, a PhD in an environmental field takes about 10 years more education than it takes to get a doctorate of medicine. Interesting thought, right? But we have folks that don't trust scientists. We have STEM disparities. STEM means science, technology, engineering, and math in this country. So there are disparities in who gets scientific degrees and who doesn't. We have economic disparities in this country, vast economic disparities. In Indian nations in particular, are subject to some of those disparities. Environmental health, as I mentioned, is not a community priority. Economic health seems to be a greater priority in this country. And because of these disparities, we have an amplification of these social vulnerabilities, which I'll talk about in a few minutes here. But climate change is the biggest driver affecting humanity, in my opinion, at this point in time. You know, I talked about treaty rights and the rights to hunt, fish, and gather, and Indian tribes, by virtue of their treaty rights, are the only people in the United States that have a right to a clean environment. I challenge anybody in this room who is not a tribal member to look through the United States Constitution, to look through the 10 articles of the Bill of Rights, and there is nothing in either of those documents that guarantees me or you to a clean environment. The Indian tribes, because they have reserved rights to hunt, fish, and gather in vast parts of the United States, are the only citizens in the U.S. that have a right to clean air, clean water, and clean food, and that's why tribes are so active in protecting the environment for everybody in the U.S. Oh, sometimes I forget, and so I write notes to myself. So we talked about when there is not clean water, clean food, or clean air, we then have an environmental abrogation of those treaty rights. And we as tribes can hold the federal government liable for those things, and that's what tribes do often to try to maintain the health of the environment. In Indian country, those social, climatic, and environmental justice issues are relatively rampant. You know, let's look at the West Coast tribes, high frequency of wildfires, see asthma, COVID-19 hammered some of the tribes. Look at the Navajo Nation, 50% of the houses in the Navajo Nation do not have running water to this day. it's impressive to think about. Some of the coastal tribes are subject to sea level rise and extreme weather events, washing these reservations into the ocean. When tribes signed these treaties with the U.S., those reservation land bases are fixed. So if that reservation is underwater, there's no getting that back again. We have legacy and emerging contaminants in subsistence foods. In Grand Portage, we have fish consumption advisories for mercury. We ask women of childbearing age to eat certain species of fish at a rate of 1 per month or less. Other species of fish that are less toxic with mercury can be eaten more frequently. But also we have PCBs, dioxins, chemicals of emerging concern, and this is a new one on the horizon, PFOA and PFOS chemicals. These are flame retardants that are residual in the environment and affect hormones, affect many different bodily systems. Mines are also subject to the environmental pollution from mining, mercury deposition from the atmosphere, acidification of water bodies, and impacts on that environmental pollution on wild rice stands. We have wildlife and zoonotic disease issues. Chronic wasting disease is a disease in deer that is expanding across the Midwest and will affect the ability of tribal folks to be able to hunt deer because we'll have to manage those deer herds intensely through population, through depopulation, I should say. From a climatic perspective, we have loss of biodiversity, diminishment of water resources. Look at the tribes out in the Southwest. Water rights issues, the Rio Grande is essentially dry. Water right doctrine dictates that first in time is the first in rights to water. But when there is no water in that watershed, there is no right to that water. Air quality issues, look at the novel elimination, is uranium mining adjacent, high level of cancers related to the inhalation of uranium dust. And extreme weather is affecting tribes across the U.S., but in particular, you look at some of these areas in the tornado belt or in the southeast, subject to hurricanes. The other thing with climate justice is because of the economic disparities, because of the justice disparities, it affects mental health as well. This young man was a tribal member. He grew up with my daughter in Head Start, worked at our agency. We brought him in as an intern 3 different times. He committed suicide about 2 years ago. A lot of times I like to mention the fact that indigenous nations, because they have fixed land bases, are disproportionately susceptible to the impacts of climate change. The other thing to think about is that climate vulnerable industries and settlements are located in coastal areas where lots of tribes are located, and tribes have lots of climate sensitive resources because of the reliance on natural resources. So nearly all tribes fit into these categories of being in coastal areas or susceptible to the impacts of climate change. Here's an interesting fact. Race is the #1 indicator of the placement of toxic facilities in this country. Why? Affluent white folks don't want a toxic facility in their backyard. I mean, that's just the reality of it. Mercury, arsenic, lead, other contaminants enter food and water and into the people that consume them. And communities of color and low-income communities are typically those that are hardest hit by the impacts of climate change. This is going to turn positive, I think, but by the end. In Grand Portage, I work on a number of these different justice issues. I work on climate justice, I work on environmental justice, and I work on social justice issues. And in these particular areas, which I'll talk about in some detail, climate justice, we're looking at brook trout, which is a cold water obligate fish species. We're looking at the moose population, we're looking at stands of wild rice. From an environmental justice perspective, we're looking at pharmaceuticals in the environment and contaminants in fish, as well as chronic wasting disease in deer. And from a social justice perspective, we're looking at educational disparities among tribal youth versus Caucasian youth. I won't go into the science of climate change. At this point in time, it's irrefutable. But I'll talk about some of the issues that we see here in Grand Portage. Grand Portage tribe was the second tribe in the nation to develop a climate vulnerability assessment and a strategic plan to adapt to climate change. And we did this by looking at every discipline within our agency's work and identifying what's vulnerable. So brook trout, what are their vulnerabilities? Moose, what are their vulnerabilities? Wild rice, every single species. Air quality, what are we vulnerable to? We're vulnerable to wildfire pollution in the air quality world. You know, in wetlands, we're subject to pollution or loss of wetlands. So we went through every single sector, from air quality, water quality, forestry, fisheries and wildlife, and even food and energy sustainability, determined their vulnerabilities and then what we would do about those vulnerabilities moving forward. One of the great things, I'm just going to bring this all up so I don't have to do it one at a time. Whoops. One of the great things about our plan, and one of the things about which I'm most proud, is that we determined very objective trigger points and thresholds to change our management strategies as climate change occurred on the reservation. And I'll give an example here. We have a lake called Trout Lake. It historically had this species of fish. A young woman is holding up a fish, caught that fish in that lake. When the brook trout population in Trout Lake exceeds this threshold of catching 10 fish per hour when you're using an electro fishing survey, that's a good rate of capture. We consider that population level to be quite high. When the brook trout population falls between this 5 and 10 fish per electro fishing hour, that causes us some level of concern. We need to maybe restore brook trout. Maybe we should change the harvest regulations in that lake to try to protect brook trout. But if we get to a point where we fail to catch brook trout in that lake for a period of 3 years or greater, we may have to conclude that climate change has changed that lake to the point that brook trout are no longer sustainable in that lake. And that's precisely what happened. So if you look at this graph shows from 1995 to 2020, okay? And each year, we collect fish presence data and water temperature data. If you look at the red line, this is the line at which brook trout die, okay? It's called the lethal thermal limit for brook trout. So beginning in about 2004, the lake began to experience water temperatures that would cause brook trout to die. After 2005, the lake was always above that temperature in the summer. Similarly, if you look at our catch curve for brook trout using electro fishing, in the 1990s, in fact in 1994, it was off the chart, our catch rate was up around the corner of that wood. And it declined precipitously at the same rate that the temperature was exceeding that lethal thermal limit. 2007 was the last brook trout we ever caught in that lake. The lake has become extirpated as a brook trout. Yeah.
What's electro fishing?
Electro fishing is a boat that we drive around the lake. It puts electricity into the water and stuns the fish. The fish float to the surface. We scoop them up. They're alive but stunned. Measure them and then we release them. So it allows us to survey fish populations in the entire lake just by driving around the shoreline. Good question. Yeah.
Have you seen an increase in other fish populations? Have you looked at that at all?
Well, we'll go into that. So in that, yeah, great question. And I should mention that in this lake, there were only brook trout and minnow species, right? So I'm working on a reservation with 3 lakes, and I have a responsibility to have fishable lakes. And one of the only fishable species of fish in that lake has now gone extinct. What am I going to do about this? Well, what we did when we measured the water temperature was we measured it not just at the surface but at depths. And so in a cool summer, about 50% of the lake volume was above that lethal thermal limit. So still some of the water was suitable to have brook trout be alive. But in a warm summer, the entire water volume of that lake exceeded that lethal thermal limit, which was why brook trout died. So what we did was we used that modeling of water volume to figure out what species would be suitable in that lake. What we chose to do was we stocked yellow perch in Trout Lake in 2004. We stocked walleye in 2006. Both are native species. They weren't native to that lake, but they're native to this region. And the lake is now fully self-sustaining for yellow perch. We still conduct supplemental stocking for walleye. I have a very strong feeling that all of the cold water lakes in northeastern Minnesota, the whitefish lakes, the lake trout lakes, splake, even rainbow trout, they're toast. I mean, that's just the reality of it. And so I think the DNR is going to need to think very seriously about what is called assisted migration, where you move other native species into these water bodies, because I think we will have a very angry public when a third of our lakes no longer have fishable fish in them. So we need to face this early at the tribe, and we're nimble enough, because we're a small agency, that we can make these types of decisions and do so. Sometimes I like to tell a joke or two. Sometimes they border on appropriateness. I'll warn you in advance. What do you call a passed out cougar? Catatonic. Same question for a male moose. It's a bulldozer. Everyone who knows me well is surprised that they actually come up that politically correct. I'll talk about moose in our climate adaptation plan as well. We have seen on the reservation and in northeastern Minnesota a population decline in moose from about 1990 to present. In our climate adaptation plan, we have very similar thresholds like we had for Trout Lake. When we have greater than 60 moose on the reservation, we consider that to be a healthy population. We don't need to do anything. When the moose population falls between 10 and 60 on the reservation, we consider that our active restoration phase. So we do research to determine what's affecting the moose population and what can we do to restore it, whether it's habitat creation or management of other species, etc. But if there's a point where a moose population falls to fewer than 10 on the res for a period of greater than 5 years, we may have to make a choice to manage for other species, like perhaps deer, for example. So these are the hard questions we think about, and we've determined some objective rules that will trigger how we change our management actions. So if you look at the moose population trend graph over time, from 1990, this one goes to 2015. It's a pretty strong declining trend in moose on the reservation, and it actually matches the population trajectory for broader Minnesota as well. And we postulated years ago that climate change, wildfire frequency, and habitat were driving moose population decline, and then we further postulated how that was happening. And so what we felt was occurring was that climate change was causing warm winters and longer growing seasons. And what that was doing was that was helping to support a much higher deer population in this region than has historically been present. Deer carry a parasite that does not affect deer at all, but it actually affects moose very badly. It's called brainworm. It's a worm that lives in the brain of a deer and reproduces there. But when that worm gets into a moose's brain, it actually causes neurological damage to the point where a moose oftentimes can't stand. They typically will walk in circles. They can't, and they can't feed properly. In addition, deer cause another issue. They cause a high number of wolves on the landscape. Wolves primarily prey on deer, but in the spring when moose give birth, moose calves are much easier to prey on than anything else and are most abundant on the landscape. So because of the high deer numbers, we're seeing a high level of brainworm in moose, and we're seeing a high level of predation on the moose calves. In addition to that, moose also have a native parasite to them called the winter tick. Interesting thing about winter ticks is their biology has all of the winter ticks in the population on moose in the winter, and then as the snow is melting in spring, the ticks drop off and they lay eggs. What has been happening is, historically we had deep snow through most of spring. That's the population level control for ticks. When winter ticks drop off and hit deep snow, they die. When winter ticks drop off and hit bare ground, they survive in extremely high numbers. What happens when moose get a high load of winter ticks, they rub all their hair off. It also causes, when you have 100,000 ticks on a moose, they actually suck all of the blood out of the moose to the point that it requires a full blood volume replacement of the moose in a 60-day period. just amazing. So, we talk about proof and facts and science. In Grand Portage, we're fortunate that we have a weather station that's been active, I think, since about 1896, but we have a really good data stream from that weather station from about the 1950s to present. If you look at the average August maximum temperature from 1960 to 1978 versus 1978 to 2011, it's increased by about 5 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 3 degrees Celsius. If you look at our average snow depth in the early spring, I was talking about winter ticks dropping off and hitting bare ground. Our early spring snow depth has dropped by about 70% in recent decades, hence the higher tick survival. So we can support our theories relatively well. We have been collaring moose in Grand Portage since 2010. I think we've collared somewhere near 200 moose over that time. And I wanted to look at how moose were using habitats. This gray area is the reservation land base, and each of these points are 400,000 or 500,000 points collected by our moose collars. So you can see that moose aren't using the landscape evenly. When you look at this using some spatial analysis, it turns out moose are only using about 35% of the land base. So I'm a natural resources manager. This tells me, well, we may not have the best habitat here. They're only using 35% of the available land base. Maybe as a habitat management strategy, we can build more moose habitat through different forestry practices. So that's one of our areas. We talked about the population decline. Well, why is the population declining? Because we have high mortality rates. So these mortality rates are in decimals, but they're actually percent. So this would be 50% of the moose population dying in a year, whereas this would be 0%, and this is 20%. So a healthy moose population sustains about 8 to 12% annual mortality, so somewhere around here. But if you look at our mortality rate indicated by these blue bars, almost every year it exceeds that, including one year when we had close to 40% population. Imagine this, imagine if 40% of humanity died in a single year. How sustainable would the human population be? At our current birth rates in the human population, it would take quite a bit of time for us to recover from that. So just something to think about when we talk about mortality rates. We're seeing somewhere between an average of 25% of the adult moose population dies every year, and they have to recover from that. And they have to recover from that through birth. And I'll show you why that doesn't work in a moment, I guess. So how are our moose dying? Well, about 30% of our moose are dying from brainworm. This is that parasite that's transmitted by deer. About 20% of our moose are dying from winter ticks. This is that parasite that, because of early snowmelt, is exploding in population. And overall, about 85% of adult moose mortality is driven by two parasites and other health issues associated with those two parasites. So we're losing 85% of moose that die just due to those factors. It's not predation, it's not human harvest, which is what we believed, going into this work years ago. We also collar calves in the spring, and we evaluate their survival rates. Remember these proportions? This is 10% death, this is 100% death. On average, we see about 80 to 90% calf mortality every year. So if you have an adult population that declines by 25%, and you have a calf population that is about 90% mortality in a given year, there is no possible way for that population to increase. It just won't work. You gotta have either a high level of births or a low level of adult deaths. You have to have one or the other. And this mortality of the calves is driven largely by, in our region, almost split equally between bear predation and wolf predation. So we talk about what can we do. As a natural resources manager, if I want to restore moose, I need to do a few things. I need to promote the development of habitat. I need to think about deer populations because they're transmitting a parasite to moose. And I need to think about predators. And so from a management perspective, what we tried in Grand Portage, we tried a spring bear hunting season to reduce some of the bear predation on moose calves. We started that in 2016. This is our bear hunting harvest prior to 2016, and then from 2016 to 2018, when we really did the spring bear hunting season, we increased our bear harvest by about 20%, but we increased our calf survival rate by about 30 to 40%. Okay? Here's a graph that's even more interesting, in my opinion. These blue bars indicate the number of calves, the proportion of calves that died as a result of bear predation. So you see a pretty high level of bear predation until 2016. After 2016, while we were doing the spring bear hunting season, we did not see another predation by bears. We don't have the ability to manage wolves currently. Wolf population is protected under the Endangered Species Act, not because it's of concern in this region, but because it's of concern nationally. But I do think if we had the opportunity to manage wolf populations just a little bit lower, I think we would actually see some survival by moose calves. So what can we do? We can create habitat. We can liberalize our harvest on deer to reduce ringworm. We've considered this and implemented this spring bear hunt. But what I would recommend is more deer harvest, possible wolf management when wolves come off the endangered species list. You know, a lot of people have very strong opinions about either protection of wolves or harvest of wolves. And I have to say, as a biologist, I'm ambivalent. All species of wildlife can be managed at socially acceptable levels. So if we suggest wolf harvest, it doesn't mean decimation of wolves. It means managing their population so that we can see a release on the calf predation rates. Same thing with deer. We can manage those populations at the levels that society thinks is acceptable. If deer populations explode, we get complaints. People are hitting deer with their cars, high insurance rates, or people are losing their gardens to deer. So any species can be managed effectively, and that's what my job is. Yeah.
So some tribes have come out against wolf harvest. Where does Grand Portage and
Wonderful question. Grand Portage is much like the rest of the population, where there are a gamut of opinions from full protection to full harvest. We have not implemented a wolf harvest policy in the past when wolves were delisted off of the Endangered Species Act, but I will say that when the state had a wolf hunting and trapping season, 2016 and 17, I can't remember when it was, we actually saw very low predation rates by wolves on our moose calves. So the level at which they were harvesting wolves seemed to be really effective, in my opinion.
For the moose.
Yes, for the moose. Yeah, exactly. All right, I'll talk a little bit about chronic wasting disease. These pink counties are counties where chronic wasting disease has been found across the United States. If you look at this area shaded in gray, remember I talked about tribes reserving rights to hunt, fish, and gather in the 1800s? Well, the Midwest is actually the largest area in the country where the tribes reserve these rights to hunt, fish, and gather, and chronic wasting disease is encroaching into these ceded territories, putting deer populations at risk and tribal subsistence at risk. So I'm leading a couple different projects to working with a number of, all these logos are different tribes in the region, other than the tribe at the university. But I'm working with about 20 different tribal agencies to conduct chronic wasting disease surveillance on deer that have been harvested by tribal hunters. In our agency, we have a mapping specialist who works with geographic information systems. Someone already sees where this one's going. And you can get these GIS specialists to make maps of anything you want. And so she gave me this map, top 12 states to live in the United States. It's a very literal interpretation. But you'll see Minnesota and Wisconsin make the list. What concerns me about chronic wasting disease is we are seeing positives show up in Minnesota. This recent positive in Beltrami County is just between the White Earth Reservation, Red Lake, and Leech Lake Reservations. And so this is of concern, which is why we're working so actively on chronic wasting disease detection. So I wrote a couple different grants to develop chronic wasting disease surveillance in Indian country in the Midwest, and we're leading a couple projects, one of which is for Minnesota specifically, and then the other is to expand that into chronic wasting disease surveillance for tribes in Michigan and Wisconsin as well.
And Michigan and Wisconsin, it's just
They have much more.
They have a much bigger issue, but
Yeah.
it's growing.
But it's growing in Minnesota, and what concerns me is our deer populations in the state, hunters won't agree with this necessarily, but our deer populations in the state are extremely high. They're much higher than historically and probably much higher than is sustainable. There are 1 million deer in the state of Minnesota. But what's happening is deer populations are being managed at too high levels, and the captive serving farms are moving deer across the country. So people are saying chronic wasting disease is moving at 60 miles an hour. That's actually through hauling of diseased animals across the country. Then those diseased animals mingle with wild animals. There's escapees from captive serving farms. Then you have chronic wasting disease in the wild. And so that's what we're seeing, is we're seeing two things: captive deer movements, high deer population, recipe for disaster. One of the things we've done to incentivize tribal members submitting heads for chronic wasting disease testing is we did a copper bullet exchange program. Lead bullets are toxic both to humans and to wildlife. And if you look at fragmentation of an average bullet, it's probably hard to make it out of this image, but this part of a deer, all these little white specks are fragmentation of a bullet that hit in the heart-lung area. And these tiny, tiny particles, we have a chemist in the room, these tiny particles have a high surface area to volume ratio, so when you ingest it by our stomach acids, you actually get more lead poisoning from a small particle than you do from a large particle. So people are consuming these lead fragments. I've seen x-rays of burger packages just speckled with lead. Similarly, wildlife are eating the gut piles, and acute lead toxicity is a primary cause of death for bald eagles. So we started a copper bullet exchange program where we offer copper bullets to tribal hunters that submit heads for deer testing. It's been a very popular program. Unfortunately, there are ammunition shortages and backlogs in the United States for 2 years, and so we actually aren't able to deliver copper bullets because there's a 2-year waiting list on ammunition. But here's an example. I mean, this is a whole batch of deer heads being brought down to the veterinary diagnostic lab at the main U for testing. Tribal hunters did a fantastic job. I'll just quickly go through this. We got about 500 heads last year compared to only 50 heads the year previously. So we'll continue expanding this. We saw a significant increase in Wisconsin. We'll continue expanding this, but it looks like tribes are going to be leaders in chronic wasting disease management. All right, quickly, some environmental justice. Another joyful graph. This graph indicates the total amount of fish flesh found in 3 of the 5 Great Lakes over time. So if you look at from 1988 to 2017, these Great Lakes had about a 90% decline in the total amount of fish in those Great Lakes. This graph carries through for the other 2 Great Lakes, it's just they didn't fit on my slide. We're talking about a 90% decline in total fish biomass over a few decades. These types of declines are happening also, I think, worldwide in fisheries and in wildlife.
Does this amortize over the volumes of the lake then? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is total fish biomass scaled to lake size.
Okay.
Good question. And so this triggered my interest in contaminants. And I have some colleagues with Minnesota Pollution Control that illustrated a few interesting things, and I'll share these facts. First of all, dosing an experimental lake up in Canada with 5 parts per trillion, this is a dot the size of a needle in a swimming pool. Okay? It's hard to visualize things in parts per trillion.
Yeah.
Parts per trillion. So think of something at the tip of a needle in the size of a swimming pool. So 5 parts per trillion of birth control hormone ethinyl estradiol caused the minnow population in that lake to collapse entirely. Subsequent to that, the lake trout population in that lake also declined. What happens is human birth control hormone in water bodies causes what's called sex reversal or sterilization of male fish. Essentially, male fish would become female. The sexuality of fish is much more fluid and is actually based on hormones. So the male fish in that lake reverted to female fish or became sterile. Similarly, 30 parts of an antidepressant called fluvoxamine caused immediate spawning in mussels. Interesting analogy to think about something like that happened with humans. There's probably 30 parts per trillion of that antidepressant in this room right now. Fish behaviors are also altered by these hormones at extremely small doses. So 1 part per trillion of female birth control hormone affects the behavior of fish. So you have the reproductive capacity of fish and the behaviors being affected at very, very low levels of different types of hormones and brain chemicals in the environment. Crayfish exposed to antidepressants exhibited a lack of risk aversion that increased their risk of predation. You want prey species to be anxious in the environment. So when you have an anti-anxiotic in a lake and your larval fish are no longer anxious when the large fish is coming to eat it, that's not really good for that population. So we collected two different native species, lake trout and walleye from 13 inland lakes in northeastern Minnesota, lake trout and lake herring from 6 sites in Lake Superior. What we found? We found 117 different pharmaceuticals in sediments, waters, and fish tissues in inland lakes and in Lake Superior. We found contamination at watersheds, the water bodies that had no human development in that watershed whatsoever. Not a cabin, not a road, not a structure. We're still finding these pharmaceuticals. Here's another Venn diagram for you. We found 15 contaminants in all 3 media of fish tissue, water, and sediments, and then varying numbers in the different media. But a total of about 20 or 35 detections in fish, almost 70 in sediment, and 100 different pharmaceuticals in the water. It's everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere. These are some of the names of the lakes. You folks are recreating up here. You may recognize some of these names. These blue ones are water bodies where we know wastewater effluent is discharged into those water bodies. So of course they had relatively high levels of pharmaceuticals. But what is interesting is these lakes here have a moderate level of human development. Either some level of development in these gray ones, like houses and cabins, or no development whatsoever. And still up to 20 pharmaceuticals in some of these lakes. So what we did was we ranked the importance of these pharmaceuticals, and we found a series of high priority ones, which are indicated here. You may recognize some of the names of them. I'll talk a little bit about what some of them do in just a second. But typically, or most commonly, we were seeing hormones and antidepressants, both brain chemicals. So this graph on the left, these are Lake Superior fish, Cisco and lake trout. We saw DEET, bug spray. That's in everything. That was in 100% of our fish samples, water samples, and sediment samples from 28 water bodies and Lake Superior. DEET is everywhere. I'm pretty sure that's why bugs don't bite me, because I eat so much fish. But we also saw things like hydrocortisone, which is a steroid, metformin, type 2 diabetes drug, like conazole, this is an antifungal, and then a series of different antidepressants. This is the graph that concerns me the most. The most frequent type of pharmaceutical we found in the environment was hormones. We just talked about what they do to behaviors and to reproductive capacity. Antidepressants. Antidepressants are brain chemicals, right? They affect how human brains work, but they also affect, in very similar ways, how zooplankton brains work, how fish brains work, amphibians. Every single species, at much, much lower doses than humans require, are affected by these different types of pharmaceuticals. And I had a hard time understanding this. How can this dose of parts per trillion impact a fish? And my colleague from Pollution Control Agency explained it beautifully. Fish are swimming and respiring in a bath of these pharmaceuticals. So if you think about the surface area of a gill, and the amount of water that gill exchanges over a 24-hour period, a fish is actually imbibing through respiration a human-level dose over a 24-hour period. So even tiny, tiny doses in the environment can still achieve a human-level dose of these pharmaceuticals in the biota. Fascinating, isn't it? I think that's the same graph I just showed. It just shows the primary drug classes by category. But what I think about this is, this graph really shows the state of human society as seen in the environment. Hormones, antidepressants, insect repellents, blood pressure medication, diabetes medication. It lets me know that as a human society, we may not be as healthy as we should be if we're requiring all of these pharmaceuticals. Here's another thing that concerns me, okay? These are the families of fish that have been shown to have sex reversal or aberrations in how their reproductive organs function with exposure to hormones, okay? So we'll start at the beginning. Sturgeon family, eel family, minnow family, catfish family, salmon family, pike family, and the different perch families. That's essentially North American fish. And so when I'm concerned about populations of fish not reproducing well and the sheer number of pharmaceuticals that we have in the environment, it makes me think we need to do a little more work on this and start doing some lab studies specifically testing the impacts we're seeing on fish at a population level at the doses that we're finding in the environment. And I talked a little bit, I won't go into much detail on this. We've been studying mercury in our subsistence fish species for years. We have determined that these species, lake cisco, round whitefish, lake whitefish, and rainbow trout, generally are lower in mercury, whereas large lake trout, primary fish subsistence species used by the tribe, yellow perch, walleye, and pike have the highest levels of mercury. So those are the ones we're most concerned about, in particular for women of childbearing age, because mercury causes developmental issues in fetal children. So what did we find? Hormones and antidepressants, primarily. Anti-cancer drugs were relatively common. These change RNA and DNA. Those are called mutagenic properties. When you have things that change RNA and DNA in the environment, think that your DNA is getting changed by those different drugs. We found widespread detection in very undeveloped locations, and like I said, we already have fish consumption advisories in place for mercury. I saw this headline that during the pandemic, kids were drinking hand sanitizer to get drunk because all these vodka factories converted to switching over to making hand sanitizer. First thing that came into my head was, at least the toilet doesn't need to get cleaned. From overconsumption. And I chatted about this with my daughter, who was about 18 at the time, and she said, "Dad, it's just good, clean fun." Let's talk about social justice. I work in Indian country and have for about 16 years, and there are some pretty significant disparities in educational attainment between the tribes and the Caucasian public. And, as an example, in the Midwest, there are 33 tribes in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Each of those tribes has a natural resources department and environmental department like ours, staffed on average with about 20 staff. So there's about 600 to 700 tribal science positions in the Midwest. Only about 10 to 15% of those positions are filled with tribal members with the right qualifications and academic background to get into those positions. So for example, I manage 2 departments, about 14 to 17 staff, depending on what season it is. I have 1 tribal member with any post-secondary education. Everybody else in my 2 departments are folks like me, white folks that went and got a secondary education. So I'm really interested in helping to develop that capacity in Indian country. And I have a PhD student who's looking at what are some of the impediments and barriers to tribal students pursuing post-secondary education and STEM career paths, with the hope that we can actually do something about this into the future. I'll leave these statistics up. These are Caucasian attainment levels versus tribal levels. But when I do that, I'll just tell a quick story. It's about privilege. A few years ago, one of my sisters was working at an early development school called a Montessori school. Some of you guys may be familiar with those, but these are absolutely beautiful learning environments where people can pay money to have their kids go get very high quality education by very well trained people. And so I went to give a presentation, much like this presentation I'm giving today, and the questions I got from these children were at the level of questions that I get from adults. Why? Because they're getting fostered educationally at a young level by people who can afford very high quality educators to do this. When I got to that facility, there was a line of black Cadillac Escalades dropping their children off. A valet would come and grab the child and walk it indoors to this environment where there were walkways and plants and there were monkeys and cages and trees and birds, and it was an absolutely gorgeous learning environment. There is no such thing in Indian country as a Montessori school where children are getting treated in that way. The consequences of that treatment are the ability to self-advocate, intellectual confidence, this belief that you have value. These characteristics can be bought by people who can afford to do so, but people who can't afford to do so can't buy that. And that's what we need. We need a Montessori-type education environment in Indian country, in my opinion, and for no cost. I mean, one of these schools costs the average annual salary of a tribal employee. But we don't think about privilege very often, but it's something that should be considered. So I have this student who's working on addressing these barriers to attainment in Indian country. But we do have some solutions. I promised I'd try to have a positive note. We need to work on climate adaptation planning in this country. We're certainly doing so in Indian country. We need to protect the sanctity of water and wildlife. We need to reduce environmental toxins for everybody. These are in your water. They're in your drinking water right now. If you were willing to send me a sample and $2,500, because that's what it takes to get it tested, I'll get it tested for you. But I can pretty much guarantee you at least 10 pharmaceuticals. We need to fund disaster mitigation and response and climate adaptation. This haven't really been legislative priorities nor funding priorities for the United States. And we could be using indigenous knowledge of land management to do a better job of stewarding this land, like incorporating these principles of seventh generation planning. So as I mentioned, when I gave this talk the first time, I gave it to potential young women voters. And people always want to know, what can I do? Turning off your LED lights 2 hours earlier is not going to do a damn thing to change climate change in the United States. What is going to change it? Legislative policy. It needs to be at a much, much broader scale. What's happening is corporations are trying to put the burden of responsibility on the individual rather than assuming that responsibility themselves. So they're saying, well, you need to pick up your litter, you need to recycle your water bottles, you need to turn off your LED lights. Now, that burden does not fall on the citizen. That burden falls on governments to legislate, that burden falls on corporations, and then it falls on citizens. We are not absolved of responsibility, but we are not the primary holders of that responsibility. Okay? So what we need folks pursuing STEM career paths. We need to develop science literacy. We need to do something about science bashing that goes on in this country. Absolutely ludicrous, in my opinion. We need to teach and communicate, and of course, everybody needs to vote. That is how we manifest change. What can governments do? Governments have a job too, right? They need to recognize this trust responsibility to the tribes. They need to protect the environment and subsistence species. Have you noticed? Our Constitution doesn't talk about a right to a clean environment. This is a basic human right. The right to survive, the right to breathe, drink, and eat, right? That needs to be addressed at some level, I think. And we need to ensure that everybody adheres to applicable federal laws. In terms of pharmaceuticals, there are a few things we can do. We can alter how prescriptions are delivered. I'll give an example. You look at a pharmaceutical commercial on TV. 90% of that commercial is a description of the side effects that come along with that pharmaceutical. 10% is about the perceived benefits that you might achieve if you take this pharmaceutical. So we can alter how prescriptions are delivered, because when you take a pill and you get all those side effects on day one, what happens with the other 89 pills in that prescription? They go right down the toilet. The problem with pharmaceuticals is they are not treated in a wastewater treatment facility. Pharmaceuticals are designed to be resilient in a biological system, right? That's why they work on all of our body parts. You excrete them in exactly the same form that you consume them. They pass through a wastewater treatment facility, also a biological system that uses bacteria to break down feces and urine. So those pharmaceuticals end up in the environment in exactly the same form that you consume them. That's why we see so many. So we can look at wastewater treatment improvements, we can look at wastewater reuse. That's going to be a huge area in the future, I think. Most wastewater can be recycled. At least then the pharmaceuticals stay within that closed loop. I'm almost done, I promise. Well, maybe. We do need some regulation to deal with how pharmaceuticals are entering into the environment. I saw a great study a few years ago. Some folks in Norway looked at pharmaceuticals in a hospital setting, and they found that 80% of pharmaceuticals that were delivered in a hospital were excreted in that hospital. So you talk about where do you want to do wastewater reuse, I think a hospital would be a great place to do so. Elder care facilities would be a great place to do so. They too are getting a high level of pharmaceutical usage. Anywhere where a lot of pharmaceuticals are being delivered where people live, that's a great place to think about pharmaceutical reuse, or water reuse, sorry.
Aren't you then just re-administering?
Well, not necessarily. So if you're thinking about wastewater reuse, I wasn't thinking necessarily of drinking water, right? I'm more thinking about your toilet water and your gray water. Yeah, you can filter that and just keep using it. But that's an absolutely great question.
For non-potable purposes.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Great question. Thanks. So I guess the theme of this talk, I'm a scientist. Science leads to justice, in my opinion. We need to address some of these systemic issues in social, environmental, and climatic justice. We need to assist with science literacy and STEM retention. And in my opinion, applied science can change the world. I'll end with maybe one more Venn diagram. And I'm happy to take any questions. Any further questions? And if not, go enjoy the beautiful weather because we only get it 3 days a year.
How about the home septic system? Is that?
Good question. So I think some of these inland lakes where we are seeing pharmaceuticals in the watershed and at a greater rate than the undeveloped watersheds, that's probably due to failed septic systems. But it's a good question and it's a completely unstudied area. You know, are these pharmaceuticals ending in the groundwater or superficial water? Are they being taken up by wetland plants and biota? It's just hard to know. But good question.
Really sensitive to obviously the STEM training stuff. And
Yeah.
I look back, when I was a kid growing up, a white kid growing up in the parks on the poor side of Duluth, they had programs throughout the country run by the National Science Foundation. I spent a whole summer on a university campus with 80 other kids doing science.
Yeah.
And we didn't pay a penny for it.
Yeah.
And it was all over the country that they did this.
That's
And they followed up over the years, and 80% of the kids that I did that with ultimately got a PhD in science in something.
so it works. I mean,
So it
the
works.
exposure works.
And it doesn't exist anymore.
I agree. I was fortunate. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area where we have all these museums. They're absolutely free. You know,
Yeah.
I did all kinds. I mean, I was so lucky as a kid. I volunteered at the National Zoo at age 13. I'm a scientist now, right? I volunteered at the Smithsonian around the same age, doing a mammal preparation class. You know, I've had some of the exact privilege that I think about. So I know I can be a beneficiary of that and serving other kids as well. Great point.
I think a positive thing that has sort of come out of it is when I was in graduate school at Wisconsin in my degree, we had 2 women.
Mhm.
And when my wife was in the PhD program at UC Davis, she was the only woman. And about the time I finished my career, 60% of the graduate students were women.
It's growing.
And that's a phenomenal.
Yeah, it's close. It's getting much closer to 50-50. In the wildlife field, it actually seems like there are more women than men in wildlife. In fisheries, it's still very much male dominated. Any women that are interested in fisheries, I really try to encourage them, because there's some great career paths in fisheries for sure.
Amazing presentation.
Yeah.
Yeah.